Hi, my name is Kate Bushry. I'm a 5th grade teacher, and this is my presentation on student-centered learning. In this presentation, I will define student-centered learning, explain the research behind the concept, see how student-centered learning can be applied in your classroom, give lesson planning tips, show how student-centered learning is linked with technology, and give the pros and cons of student-centered learning. Student-centered learning has been linked with other terms in education, such as experiential learning or flexible learning, but at its heart it is simply the way teachers think about and approach student learning. Instead of the emphasis being on what the teacher teaches, content learning, or the teacher himself, instructional learning, the student is the focus, model, and device by which instruction is driven. It requires that teachers' planning, teaching, and assessment focuses on the needs and abilities of the students, how they learn, what they experience, and how they engage in their learning. Student-centered learning is not a new idea, but has become increasingly popular as the more traditional teaching styles of lecturing and testing have begun to be criticized. Many researchers believe that putting students in the driver's seat is the key to creating a successful learning environment. Research that supports student-centered learning includes the self-determination theory. This focuses on the degree to which an individual's behavior is self-motivated and self-determined. This theory states that every student has the same basic needs, including competence, relatedness, and autonomy, and therefore the degree to which these needs are met determines motivation. It makes sense, then, that the more students are connected, responsible, and in charge of their own learning, the more they will be connected and motivated to learn. Marzano's brain research suggests that one important system in our brain is the self system, which determines whether or not a learner will engage in a task and decides what the brain will attend to. He theorizes that if students have no brain connection to what they are learning because it is teacher-driven and created, their self-system will not allow them to engage in the learning. Camborne's 8 conditions of learning include immersion, responsibility, modeling, approximations, use of practice, response feedback, expectation, and engagement. All of these conditions create an ideal student-centered environment where students are connected to their learning while being guided by their teacher to achieve maximum understanding and success. These conditions are often seen outwardly through behaviors of the learners, planning of the teacher, and the environment to which children learn. Student-centered learning requires that teachers allow students to have opportunities to set and reset their own goals, define strategies, and identify indicators of success. Teachers must allow students to think about their own performance, become better at asking questions of themselves too, and develop personal efficacy, belief in their own competence. While teacher-centered learning has the teacher in the active role and the student in a passive role, student-centered learning requires students to be active, responsible participants in their own learning. Teachers then become facilitators, helping students access information, interpret, organize, and use knowledge to solve problems. In student-centered learning, students also have a high level of choice and power in the classroom, as opposed to a very low level in a teacher-centered classroom. For example, an objective in a teacher-centered classroom may sound something like this: we are going to study a chapter on explorers. In a student-centered learning classroom, the objective may sound more like this: by the end of this chapter on explorers, you will be able to identify 10 explorers and their achievements. Student-centered learning can be incorporated into any type of instruction in the classroom. For example, during direct instruction, teachers can have students work in buzz groups, where they have short discussions on the content and then share their thoughts. Students can do a writing reflection on a particular topic or role-play a series of events. All of these engage the students in their learning and make them active instead of passive participants. Independent practice leaves even more room for student-centered learning and can include giving students a choice in how to show understanding of a certain topic. The teachers may even want to give students a choice in the topic that they research or study. Allowing students to debate a topic also puts them in an active role and causes them to develop connections to the content. Also, by allowing students to work in groups or teams, they can learn content along with important social skills and role responsibilities that will help them become better problem solvers and later employees. While assessment may seem like a teacher-directed area of education, students can be given more responsibility in this area. Again, giving students a choice in how they will be assessed is a good practice in an SEL classroom. But certain assessments, such as portfolios, journals, and other types of formative assessments, are more student-centered than traditional tests and quizzes. To begin the practice of student-centered learning in the classroom, teachers can start by simply rephrasing their objectives to put the focus on the students. For example, instead of saying, "In this chapter, we will cover the structure of the heart," they can state, "By the end of this unit, you will be able to recognize the structure of the heart." Also, sharing these objectives with students can give them something clear and tangible to work towards. This can be taken a step further by also allowing students to help form and create their own objectives for a given unit of study. Even doing a simple KWL chart, what I know, what I want to know, and what I learned, allows students to think about wanting to learn instead of being told they have to. It is also good for teachers to include experiential outcomes in their lesson plans. These are the indicators of how students may feel during a lesson, how they are engaged and connected to the content. If a teacher looks for ways to specifically engage and connect students into the lesson, and then evaluates how and if students are connected, more student-centered learning can take place. The lesson plan template seen here is an example of how to include experiential outcomes in your lesson plan design. Student-centered learning lends itself easily to the use of technology in the classroom, since most technology requires direct connection to the students. For technology to enhance student-centered learning, it must be inquiry-based, active, and interactive. Project-based learning can easily be connected to technology and includes things such as web quests, interactive videos, podcasts, and research. When used correctly, these projects place students in the active role recommended by student-centered learning and allows them to make meaningful connections to the content. Also, student enjoyment is increased with the use of technology, and as previously stated, will also allow them to connect to the content on a deeper level. There still remain some differing opinions on the success of student-centered learning in the classroom. Some pros include that research suggests that student-centered learning is effective for every member of the classroom because it takes into account their diverse learning needs and greatly increases student retention of both knowledge and skills. Students are excited when they discover something for themselves. This excitement motivates them to learn and usually leads to better engagement and longer retention of knowledge. Also, students gain confidence in themselves as they take on new responsibilities and become competent problem solvers. Students have higher achievement when they have confidence in themselves and when they can attribute their success to their own abilities and not to luck or help from the teacher. Some cons include that some educators believe that if there's too much focus placed on the individual learner and their needs, it becomes impossible for the teacher to focus on larger principles and concepts. There is also the possibility of overemphasizing this idea to the students themselves, causing them to focus solely on their own needs and not understand and be sensitive to the needs of those around them. Another con is that many agree that student-centered learning is a mostly Western concept and therefore does not prepare our students as well to compete on the global stage. This concludes my presentation on student-centered learning. I hope you enjoyed it and can take some of these principles into your classroom to increase your students' enjoyment and success. Thank you.